Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. You all know who I am. I opened this morning. And so who we have with us today, um, off to the left here, we have Noah Deitch, who's at DOE as a senior advisor in fossil energy and carbon management, which is where I was for 3.5 years before here. Everybody okay back there? It's like kind of like Taylor Swift. Hey, it's like Taylor Swift. And, at her concerts. Everybody okay? Do you need water? Okay. All right. All right. Okay. And next we have Nina Morris, who's Penn's Director of Sustainability on campus. And then we have Seth Shapiro, who's CEO of the Philadelphia Gas Works. And then we have Zan Fishman, who's joining us here from the Bipartisan Policy Center. So a great mix. And one thing I'll say in kind of framing the discussion that I'd like to have is, we started the day thinking about the role of removals in net zero. In Rob's presentation, he talked in a broad context of first and foremost prioritizing deep decarbonization and thinking about the role of removals. And I also tried to set up the day with the interplay. I think at this point, we don't need, our audience is sophisticated enough and we're not conflating mitigation and carbon removal. We know that these are two different tools, they're different. And so what I kind of want us to be thinking about is the interplay of mitigation and removals, especially when it comes to some of these supply chains that we've looked at. When we looked at cement and concrete, we looked at the agricultural sector, we looked at hydrogen, and then there's also this outstanding question of who's going to pay? Who are these first movers, these first markets that are willing to pay? And what does that demand look like? And so with that, I want to start with Noah, and this is close to home because, again, I was with Noah for a long time at DOE and have known you since your master's at Berkeley in business. But anyway, you were recruited into DOE because you have really creative solutions. You did some really unique things, but it is this outstanding question of how do we stimulate demand beyond the first of a kind infrastructure law investments? Noah?
Yeah, Jen, thank you so much. You are deeply missed at DOE. Saying that I was recruited is very kind. Maybe I'll say a few things on net zero and the role of carbon removal. I think one of the pieces is the kind of obvious top line here, which is we can't come up with reasonable assumptions in how to get to net zero without carbon removal. I'm not going to say it's necessary, but we don't have a reasonable path to get there without it. So in many ways, we need it if we want net zero. But I think we think about carbon removal not as this, oh gosh, we have to do it. Ugh, now let's figure out how, right? But we see it as an opportunity. And I think that opportunity comes in two ways. One, really framed well by the Roads to Removal report. I know we have so many folks here from that Herculean effort that Jen helped kickstart, 3 years ago at this point. But I think what's so powerful about that report is it frames carbon removal not in just the technical potential, how much does it cost, where can it go? What does that look like for communities that want to potentially participate in a carbon removing economy of the future? What do those jobs look like? Where are they? And somebody mentioned earlier, you can't really talk about aiming solutions or these kind of technical things that nobody really knows. People understand getting paid more to farm or to have jobs like their oil and gas jobs, just putting the carbon from the air back in the ground, not the opposite. And I think those are really, really powerful stories. And that role in net zero, I think, is incredibly important because of the political implications of that. I think one of the things that's often implied from our political conversation is there's this fixed pot of money and we get to decide how much is mitigation and how much is removal. And we want to use as much of that as we can for mitigation and just as the minimal amount for removal. That's not how our politics works. If you look at the Senate, it does not function in that kind of logical, technocratic way, right? It functions like the Senate functions. And so what we end up having is a need for a diversity of solutions to get to any climate policy at all. And I think by expanding the aperture of what you get, we actually get to net zero, and we get to do more mitigation by expanding this to be not just mitigation, but the mitigation and removal pieces together. And I think that's a really powerful aspect of what we need to do to get to net zero as fast as we can, is to think about not just the techno-economics, not just the communities, but the politics of this all as well.
Thank you, Noah. Okay, well, we're going to shift over to Nina Morris, and thinking really close to home here at the UPenn campus, and in the goals of the UPenn campus, and what are we thinking about in terms of scope 1, scope 2, all of these hard things. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So hi, like Jen said, I'm Nina Morris. I'm the Sustainability Director here at Penn. And so I think about this question a lot all day long. So as the Sustainability Director, I'm charged with leading the Sustainability Office as well as Penn's Climate and Sustainability Action Plan. And we are also charged with the tracking, reporting, and communications for Penn's carbon footprint. So, I think about how is Penn going to achieve its carbon neutrality goal by 2042, and what are the ways in which we can do that, and what is the role of the various tools in our toolkit to achieve carbon neutrality. So I think of it as like you can walk and chew gum, right? Like you can do two things at once. And so mitigation and removals both are things that we're thinking about at the same time. And so for our scope 1 and 2 emissions, we are situated in the city of Philadelphia, right? And so we don't have the same opportunities to generate our own electricity that you may find in more rural campuses. So a lot of our energy comes from both purchased electricity and then a local steam provider vicinity. And so we have to work within the larger systems and use our influence to find solutions that utilize renewable energy, as well as your traditional avoiding emissions in the first place, right? Like that's a huge piece. Like energy efficiency is still something that we are striving for constantly. But there is an inevitability that we do need energy. And so where we choose to procure that energy, how we use our influence are things that we constantly think about and try to fold into our overarching strategy. So, and so that's for our scope 1 and 2. We also include a couple of scope 3s in our carbon footprint, air travel, commuting, and waste. And so like we were talking about for this conference, flights consume a lot of energy and greenhouse gas emissions. And so I was lucky to be a part of Penn's air travel working group, which developed a mechanism to track and then also ask for money from all the different schools so that we can collect those funds and then offset the emissions from air travel. And so we are now actively identifying projects for investment in the voluntary carbon market. And so firsthand experience now being a purchaser and off-taker of carbon offsets. And so, it's just been a very educational opportunity to see what it's like to actually be a purchaser and look for the verification, the permanence, the additionality, and how do we factor that into the selection of our offsets.
Great, thank you, Nina. Next, we'll switch over to Seth Shapiro. And Seth, given your leadership role at Philadelphia Gas Works, in recognizing what Nina just said about our energy access, Penn is an urban campus. We all know here who are local that there's 40 miles of pipeline under the city, and that's essentially providing steam. And the steam is generated not far from my lab at Pennovation, at Grays Ferry, and it's natural gas sourced today. But there's an opportunity, especially when we heard about all the biomass here in the state of Pennsylvania, the forests, the agriculture. Is there thinking in terms of diversifying the portfolio, thinking about renewable natural gas or blending with hydrogen? Is that something that's on the radar? And can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, but let me start with a little context.
Go for it.
And first, I'm very appreciative for being here. I found today fascinating and obviously it's an audience, it's a topic that I don't get to interact with very much. And so really learned a ton and appreciated the dialogue. For folks who may not be from the area, the Philadelphia Gas Works is the largest municipally owned gas utility in the country. And what that means is if you look at the distribution companies around the country, all of the big ones are owned by investor-owned utilities. They have shareholders, they have dividends, they have stock, et cetera. We are owned by the city of Philadelphia. And that means a couple things. We have 500,000 customers. If you look at our customers serving just Philadelphia, they are extraordinarily challenged. 20% of them are low income. Significantly, if you then add to low income what we call ALICE, and there were a lot of acronyms today, so I'll tell you what ALICE is: asset limited, income constrained, employed, right? If you include ALICE, half of our customers are either ALICE or low income. And think about the challenge that presents. Now, if you think about how we approach our business, every decision we make, we look through sort of 4 lenses. We have to be safe, we have to be reliable, we have to be affordable, and we have to be sustainable. And everything we do, we look at through those lenses, right? But what you realize is that progress in any one of those directions has impacts on other aspects of the company and on those other pieces, right? I actually loved that in the plenary discussion, Dr. Sokolow put up, here are the different strategies, but let's also understand what are the outfalls of those strategies and what are the problems, right? So you can see logically, if you said, oh, all I care about is affordability, we're gonna make gas free. But then we're not gonna have the resources to maintain the pipeline infrastructure. We're not gonna be able to make any progress towards decarbonizing, and things collapse and you start to have safety incidents. Look at it the other way. If you pursue decarbonization at the expense of everything else, sure, we could decarbonize and abandon fossil fuels, and we'd love to do so. The problem is, at what cost to our rate base, which we already talked about being challenged. And so we try and make incremental progress in each of those areas as sort of quickly as we can, with trying to weigh the balance, trying to weigh, can our folks take it? So to the question, though, we are pursuing a whole host of, we call them, we put them in the bucket of diversification, but they are all about throwing things at the wall to seeing what's the technology that's gonna fit, that's gonna make some sense. So we are an integral part of the hydrogen hub, and you heard about hydrogen before, and we are pursuing hydrogen. In fact, we're pursuing a hydrogen project that would include Vicinity and the steam that's provided to Penn and to other customers. Really, really exciting. Really expensive, lots of things to solve. All the things you heard before about 45V and like all of those are obstacles that we have to overcome. We're pursuing RNG. We talked about renewable natural gas, and as you talked about how you're getting creative about both mitigating the amount of fossil fuels that you have to pull out of the ground, but then also trying to deal with all of the carbon that's put into the atmosphere just by trash disposal and wastewater management. We're working with the water department to try and capture all of the biogas that they are producing through their wastewater stream, purify it, pressurize it, put it into our system. One of our proposals for the hydrogen hub includes using that through SMR and carbon capture to create hydrogen that we can then distribute to some of the hard to decarbonize sectors. Again, every step along the way has huge obstacles and huge affordability issues. And we're weighing through it. So I think what I liked most about this conference and thinking about it is it embraced the sort of all of the above strategy. There is no silver bullet. I think anyone who really spends time on it knows that it's incumbent upon us to embrace almost every strategy that works. We had a discussion at lunch and I said, there are, there are some bad ideas, but there are lots of good ideas, and we have to pursue as many of them as we can. So
awesome. Thank you, Seth. Okay, let's go to Zan. Hey, thinking about bipartisan, the bipartisan infrastructure law, it went through. There was a time when we were all wondering. And then I extended my leave at Penn a whole year and a half because the Inflation Reduction Act passed. It was pretty exciting. But these go through because there's, nothing is a perfect solution, right? Not everybody's going to be happy with any one of these directions. And I got reminded a little bit in my government job of like, hey, it's bipartisan for a reason, And so what do you feel, being at the Bipartisan Policy Center, recognizing that when we look at carbon removals in this space, and even reflecting on some of the conversations today. How do you view this?
Well, thank you for having me here. And for those of you who don't know, the Bipartisan Policy Center, we're a DC-based think tank, and our mission is to find good policy that can get bipartisan support, which is very easy. Rarely. And we bring people together. We bring together Democrats and Republicans. We bring together industry and environmental organizations. We get the stakeholders around the table and we figure out what can we do together, where can we find agreement and move us forward. And carbon dioxide removal has been one of those areas, which is I think really interesting. And you know, it's worth remembering that the goal that we're talking about here is net zero. And it's not zero. The word net is there for a reason. And carbon dioxide removal, that's the net part, right? That's the negative side of the ledger to balance out the positive side of the ledger. It's like when everyone's thinking about like what is the North Star when we're thinking about for climate, it's net zero. It assumes that we're doing both, removing and mitigating. It's really important. But when you're thinking about, you know, bipartisan politics, one of the things that you might forget sometimes is that Democrats and Republicans often don't agree on things. What is the role of government? What is the role of taxes or tax credits? How much control should regulators have versus industry versus communities versus states and local governments and federal government? All of these are big questions. And when you're thinking about how can you make progress against climate change, finding the areas of agreement has been historically difficult. For a long time, there was somewhat of a partisan divide in like, should we do anything as a government against climate change? More and more so, we're seeing that that's really bipartisan, that we should. And that's really great. Like you look at the Senate, there's a bipartisan climate solutions caucus. You look at the House, there's a conservative climate caucus with more than 80 members who signed up to say, I am part of the conservative, you know, more than 80 Republicans. I'm part of the conservative climate caucus. We believe that climate change exists and that humans are a cause, right? Like that's a big deal. Like you wouldn't have suspected that might have been the case 10 years ago. But then what can they do? What can they agree on? And we found CDR to be one of those things. There was bipartisan support for the DAC hubs program in the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's been bipartisan support for government procurement. There's a bipartisan bill in the Senate called the CREST Act. There's bipartisan support for research and development, RD&D. And so, you know, I'm very optimistic that we can do more. And just kind of big picture, you know, what I was thinking, like, what I want to talk about. We're at this Roads to Removal conference. And are you familiar with that poem by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken? Right, you know,
Of course.
two roads to removal diverged in a yellow wood. There are a couple key themes there that I think are really relevant. And you know, one of them is that you're changed in the process, right? Like you start at the beginning and you go through your process and you look back and you're a different person. And the other key theme is that there is a road that you didn't take, and that's kind of an opportunity cost. And I think thinking about both of those in this space is really interesting, because one of the things we have to do is deploy and scale. Like we really need to deploy and scale so that we can go down that path and learn and come out a different person and in a different technology. The other thing we need to do is think about what is that road that we're not taking. And the good news is that not any one of us has to solve this all alone. There are a bunch of us that can take different roads and go down that path. And I think as we're thinking about policy, we're thinking about funding both scale and innovation at the same time, so that we can go down multiple paths and achieve the goal.
Fantastic, thank you. And I want to keep a pulse out on any kind of questions from the audience and anything that's coming online virtual. But I'll ask a question kind of for everybody, whoever wants to might answer, is, you know, one of the things that we've talked about today too is as we look at the scale of carbon removal that we'll need by mid-century, In the United States, we emit on the order of about 6 gigatons of CO2 every year. And so the question is, if we're to achieve net zero by 2050, how much removal do we need? How fast do we really need to scale this up if we're to get to the question mark by 2050? And so one way to think about this is, okay, if we're 6 gigatons, what are those sectors that are causing those emissions today? And what are the pathways that we're seeing in decarbonizing, and on what timescales do we expect that decarbonization to take place? Sometimes we can think about it in terms of this residual emissions question, in terms of just the hard to decarbonize sectors. Talked a little bit about those, like the agricultural sector, some parts of transportation like shipping, trucking, aviation. That all adds up to about a gigaton globally, or in the United States. So now, if we need to scale up to a gigaton by mid-century, and we're, say, at 1,000 tons of in the US today of removals, that's 6 zeros. That's a lot in what, 30 years? So it's pretty significant. But maybe we don't even have the residuals calculation right. And how important is that? Because all I just said is that's assuming we're going to decarbonize. Going back to what Seth said, the most important thing is that everybody has access to energy to meet their basic needs, and that it's economic, it's affordable, it's sustainable, and oh, by the way, now we're requiring it to be clean. And how we extract it out of the earth needs to minimize environmental impacts too, not just greenhouse gases. And so all of that needs to take place, and there's this big question mark, bill, IRA, the demand, how fast, and what truly is the role of carbon removal in terms of residual, and what does residual look like, really? And that was a lot, and I'm back to being a professor, so I can't help it.
Well, maybe one way to think about this, Jen, is what do we have to do in the next 5 years if we don't know whether we're going to need hundreds of megatons, gigatons, or tens of gigatons? And the answer is actually the same. We need to get that 1,000-ton per year project up to the million-ton per year scale, and we need to do so across this portfolio of solutions. Within each of those solutions, not pick winners, make sure we have technology diversity. And then great scientists like Roger Ains figure out we need roughly 25 million tons per year of CDR demand by the end of this decade. Kind of regardless of where we're going, that's what will give us the option to say, how do we work and figure out the policy mechanisms to get to scale? And so I think that's really framing our thinking right now. And I don't think Frost ever mentioned demand side policy in any poems. But I think that's really the key, because if you think about what's it going to take to get to 25 million tons per year, that's way more than we're at today. Mm-hmm. And we are going to need some combination of new policy and the voluntary carbon market to scale orders of magnitude from where it is today to actually meet that demand. And I think that's the real challenge that we have in the next 5 years, is to figure out how to make sure that we can scale to whatever need we have. And I think the beauty of this is, as we do that technology innovation and build those early market mechanisms and MMRV standards, all this infrastructure that we'll need, we'll have more insight in 5-10 years about how much CDR we're going to need by when. And we'll actually be able to have that conversation about, okay, how fast do we go? Because we will know what works and what doesn't, and have some idea about what to scale.
Thank you.
I'll sort of answer it. We try and reconcile the fact that to meet the affordability and reliability goals, we have no choice but to continue operating as we operate. So how do we attack the demand side? And we spend a lot of time. You talk about scope 3. Our scope 3 is our 10,000-pound gorilla, right? It's the usage of all our customers. We, starting last year and really starting 2 years ago, we track our scope 3, and our corporate goals are around how we reduce the scope 3 emissions. We spend an enormous amount of time trying to make sure that our system doesn't leak. We put in millions and millions of dollars a year to replace the most leaky pipe. We have sophisticated models to try and target which ones are doing it, and so we're trying to lower our footprint. We have a whole data and analytics group, and what it tells us is that we're having good impacts. We have seen no reduction in customers but our use per customer has dropped significantly. So in the last 2 years, we've dropped, or the last time we looked at it, we went from 72 decatherms per customer to 68, I think. So we're seeing a big reduction in what they're using, even though it's the same number of customers. So that's all real good. On the other hand, to be a pessimist, we need as much as we can because the world burned more coal last year than ever in its history, right? If you look at what's going on globally, the data is awful, right? So we need to do our share and significantly more to counteract trends that are going on all over the place. And so we sort of embrace both of those things. We are really, really focused on reducing our footprint, reducing the usage of our customers. We weatherize low-income homes. We offer discounts on setback thermostats, all those things to reduce usage, plus, experimenting with hydrogen and renewable gas and geothermal and things like that, but also embracing technologies and trying to help develop new technologies that then can be spread around the world so that they can catch up quicker than we did.
I mean, I would just say, at the end of the day, the goal is to achieve net zero and to do it in a way that's like as good for people as we possibly can. And I think we don't know how much CDR we're going to need, just like I don't think we know what role hydrogen is going to play in 2050. And we don't know what role, all of, geothermal versus small modular reactors, like we just don't know. We have no idea. They will probably each play some role in some proportion that we can't yet predict. And we don't know what that breakthrough is going to come in terms of cost and scale. And it's it's not just cost. There's also lots of other factors that put constraints on how big something can scale: land use and water use, et cetera. And so there's a world in which we find out that it's actually easier to mitigate than we thought. We have these amazing breakthroughs and we need less CDR than we thought. Okay, great. We also might find that there's a world in which we find that it's harder to mitigate than we thought, and we need more CDR than we thought. And I think it's just worth, adding in, just because we haven't yet, and during this conversation, is that, net zero is the goal, but that's the goal of step one, that's where we're going to end up. And then we're going to look around and we're going to say, okay, global warming has happened, and here we are, and there have been consequences. How much net negative do we need to go? And even if we have really, really cheap mitigation, without CDR, we're not getting a whole bunch of net negative. And I think it's important to think even farther in the future as well.
Nina, did you want to come?
Just a little bit. So I was just thinking about how the perspectives, what's the role of these different levers that we're pushing so that we reach carbon neutrality or net zero. And something we haven't really talked about is the demand side, who is demanding for carbon neutrality, and what is the market assurance that they're going to be there to invest continually into these carbon removal technologies. And so, I don't have an answer to this, but just thinking about how it's not something that we talked a lot about today is who is investing in this, and what does the demand look like? So from the perspective of UPenn, we have an internal goal to be carbon neutral. We set that for ourselves, right? So we are going to hold ourselves to that standard, and we'll continue to purchase offsets towards our carbon neutrality goal for those components that we cannot address on our own. Obviously, we do everything we can for our scope 1 and 2, but that's a choice that we make. So I'm just curious, what are the levers that we're going to use to ensure that there is a demand to invest in these technologies so that we can all play a role in achieving carbon neutrality? So that's a question for you, Jen.
I don't know. I was looking over because I didn't know if Noah had any magic answers.
Alas, no magic answers, but I think what we have seen work today is this patchwork of a whole bunch of different things. Some set of government policies, and government policies are a very different thing if you're in the United States, if you're in Europe, and everywhere else has their own kind of bespoke approach. Voluntary carbon market demand, which 5 years ago, if you told me that folks were signing $1 billion worth of CDR purchases, I would have literally not believed you. And yet here we are today. So it's kind of, I don't really know where it will come from, but I think if we pursue lots of different angles, that it collectively can kind of get us to that bridge. I think folks have this implicit assumption that we'll one day get to a more consistent framework where there's some sort of economy-wide carbon policy here in the US and abroad that kind of drives a lot of this forward. But for the indefinite future, we don't necessarily need that. We can still continue to almost muddle forward, but quite successfully with the patchwork of policies that we have.
Well, one thing I'll say too, from, Nina, from your reflection there, is that what we do know is our students are motivated, they're excited, they want to be part of the solution. So I think by being at a university and actually playing a leadership role in reducing scope 1, scope 2, and then even being the kind of the front movers in procuring low carbon supply chains where they're available, and being creative. And some of these maybe is low carbon concrete and it embodies carbon, and really going bold, and with our vet school and agriculture, thinking about the practices that they're developing of how can we leverage that and actually think about in an application of where we're procuring food from, for our cafeterias on campus or our cafes on campus, and thinking about, are the farms that we're procuring from locally in Pennsylvania, are they adopting the practices that we're developing at the vet school? And thinking about this way, which by the way is kind of the essence of Benjamin Franklin, who founded the university. But thinking creatively and then setting an example for other universities to do the same, I think could be something pretty cool. And also, not to mention, it feels good being a student at a university that's doing that. Okay, we've got some questions, right, Susan?
Hello, I had a question, and I thought it was for Zan, but it could be for anybody. As a product of a bipartisan household, I can assume that your job is really simple. And my question to you is, when you are looking for support for CDR projects and programs, do you only get to go to those 80 wonderful people in the conservative climate caucus? Or have you actually found people that are climate change deniers that have ever supported CDR? Do those exist? If so, tell me how you reach them.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that members of Congress typically are trying to be good representatives of their constituents. And each district is different. There are some districts, for example, that are heavy agricultural districts. And in a heavy agricultural district, there could be a revenue opportunity for doing enhanced rock weathering as a farmer. And you might say, look, this is just good economics for me. Maybe I don't know if climate change exists or not, maybe I don't care. But if the economics of it work out, it's something that I can do. So, in general, I do think we can take multiple strategies for attracting support. And it doesn't have to all be about people who have climate as their primary focus. The economics of it really matter.
Hi, good evening. My name is Erica Phillips. I'm a planner in Somerset County. I work as an environmental and resiliency planner. And I was really happy to see this report come out. I'll tell everybody in this room, on a county level, it was great. And it gave me fodder to go to my, higher ups and ask for, if we could implement some different things in our county on, as it relates to carbon removal. So my question is for you, Seth. I wanted to know how I don't know if this is something that we talk about offline, but the one thing that I was interested that you said was how you did stuff with municipal water and getting the gases off of municipal water. That's a problem that we have. We have stormwater, wastewater, and I was wondering if that's something that you could elaborate on, or if it's maybe something that's too technical that we talk offline, but that's a good, in my opinion, good opportunity to address.
So good question, and there's pieces that are better to discuss offline, but I'll try and focus on some of the relevant pieces, and I'll tell you. So we're one of the top 25 gas distribution companies in the country, and so I'm on the board of the American Gas Association with my peers. And at I think every AGA conference in the last, I don't know, 2 years, there has been at least one panel or one discussion about renewable natural gas and whether it's coming off a trash stream or coming off of a wastewater stream. One of the biggest hurdles that my peers have is that you're trying to finance these projects over long periods of time, and trying to get a reliable source of the biogas enough to finance a project is a challenge. One of the huge advantages that we have is being owned by the city of Philadelphia and having a water department that is owned by the city of Philadelphia. We can, in essence, tie up the stream of biogas in perpetuity. That's an enormous, enormous advantage. And so that little hook helped. Understand that I imagine you are seeing increasingly water treatment facilities capturing their biogas in some way. And the water department here is already in one of their plants, and half of the other one is already capturing biogas. They're using some of it to burn for some of their processes on site. Some of it they're flaring. And so the easiest piece is, can we just step in and can we say, hey, instead of flaring, let us capture it and treat it? But again, not everything's rosy, right? It's expensive. It's expensive to then purify it and get it into the right condition. It's expensive to pressurize it and get it into the pipeline. And depending on how far you have to go, we also benefit from their facility is proximate to one of our plants. We have 2 major plants. So, you have to have a little bit of luck of being in the right place, but we can certainly talk about more details. And again, you're seeing these pop up all over the country. It's a win-win. You're both preventing the methane from going into the air that it's already doing, and you're then mitigating having to take additional fossil fuels out of the ground.
Can I just say how cool of a question that is? And the fact that we're talking about like wastewater treatment at a county level compared to, I don't know, we talk a lot in the DC orbit about the 45Q tax credit, or will there be a cap and trade, right? And that's kind of how we assumed carbon removal policy would happen, but that's not likely how it's actually going to happen. You're going to have, again, a whole bunch of things that nobody really thought about until they said, oh, we have the supply of biogas. How can we actually make that net negative? And I think that's something that we should embrace in the diversity of not just the solutions, but the policy options. And we don't need to sell carbon credits to make this thing work. We can figure out how to do it at a very local and industry or even plant specific level. And that's just really exciting to hear.
Looks like velocity.
I have a question about degrowth. Do you all see that as a possibility for what the demand side looks like? We've had a lot of conversation around, the cement or concrete we use, adjusting the way that we make it. Is there a policy pathway to us consuming less or using less or doing less?
I mean, I'll jump on that. I think our best chance of success is pursuing strategies that are consistent with people having better lives. And I think asking people to suffer tends to be a bad strategy for accomplishing goals. I mean, just thinking back to like how big of a political blunder it was when President Carter told people to wear sweaters and to adjust their thermostats, right? Like, he was asking people to suffer. And it doesn't really matter whether there's merit to the idea or anything. It's just, we should all be trying to accomplish our goals and have people have better lives, right? We should have more affordable energy, not less affordable energy, as we're pursuing climate change. We should have more, better quality of life, less pollution, right? I just think there's a real danger in the degrowth mindset, in that it number one would make people suffer, but number two, I think, make it less likely for us to achieve the overarching goal because of the political backlash to those sorts of policies.
I agree. And I can also say that I think efficiency has an important role to play. So it's not exactly degrowth, but just being more conscious of your consumption is always a good move. at the campus level, we think a lot about our labs because they consume an insane amount of energy per square foot. One ULT, ultra low temperature freezer, uses as much energy as one US home on average, and we have over 1,600 of those on our campus. So, so what research is essential, right? That's like what we're here to do. So it's not necessarily like saying we have to get rid of every single ULT, but what are the maintenance practices that we're not necessarily keeping up with that we could employ that actually saves energy, but it requires just like a scooch more work on the part of the lab staff or the maintenance staff, right? But so there's like interventions that you can do to help reduce that consumption without encouraging that suffering. And it does help when there are incentives to do strategies like that. It could be as simple as just saving money is also a really good way. So not to say that energy should be super expensive, but it does help when you see the benefits in both carbon and cost savings.
Reminds me of adopting the Nest thermostats, you know, something that's actually easy to use. Okay, Shelby.
Hi, I'm Shelby. I'm a PhD student in chemical engineering at Penn. I have a question for Nina specifically, but then also like for you all broadly. I'm asking you on like a Penn level, but then broadly like on a policy level. What like for Penn as we continue to see new buildings go up and more research, which is really exciting. What levers do students have to like you said, demand carbon or low carbon buildings or sustainable like building practices like we've heard about in the built environment in previous panels? And then broadly, like what do you want to see from your constituents, like of each of your organizations that you represent, and what is exciting like behavior for those constituents for encouraging the CDR and climate goals like we talked about today?
I love this question. So there are so many things that students can do to encourage energy conservation, better management of our buildings, to help us reduce our carbon intensity. We have things in place already, thankfully. We do have a LEED silver minimum standard for all major renovations and new construction. We are working on sustainable design guidelines right now that are going to help with any projects that don't qualify for LEED. So we are finding those levers to ensure that our buildings do hit a high threshold for energy conservation and efficiency. And beyond. We were talking about embodied carbon. I was actually just talking with VJ and some students about the embodied carbon for Amy Gutman Hall and how we can, start to look at that more closely. So there are so many different avenues that students can use their time here at Penn to help Penn become an example of what it means to live and breathe climate action. Everything from the way you are in your dorm, like turning off your lights when you leave a room. It's so basic, but it still helps. To learning more about where our energy comes from on our campus. So there's just a myriad of ways in which you can get engaged. And the Sustainability Office has many internships. Okay, I'm done.
It's another great question. I talked about us tracking our scope 3 and trying to work both with our residential customers, but also with developers on employing the most aggressive demand side management. And what I hear back from them when I speak at their events is, yeah, we can't do it because no one's willing to pay a premium, right? And so the real question is, would you pay more to live in a dorm that was built to higher LEED standards? Would you pay more to live in a dorm that committed to being exclusively renewable electric, right? And so what we find all along is, okay, but you have to make those decisions make sense for the businesses or the institutions that are doing it. So it's about behavior as much as anything. And yes, the advocacy is really important as well. But that's what's really incumbent upon all of us, right? Are you willing to pay more for the stuff that's more environmentally sensitive? Once we are, it'll happen, right? The market will fix itself. And this is a non sequitur, but when I was listening to both in the hydrogen panel, how do you create markets? And it also applies to the CDR. How do you create markets? One of the things we're struggling right now trying to get private sector partners for some of our projects is when the government is picking winners and losers. Everyone's afraid that if you have a shift in administration, those policies go away, right? And you need to finance these things over decades. And so are we going to put $100 million into building an RNG facility that only works because there's policies that require these things? And then if a different administration comes in, do you lose it, right? There was a whole weatherization industry that existed in the UK that collapsed overnight when they changed the policy and no longer required weatherization. And you literally had a handful of companies that went bankrupt overnight. And people don't want to be that company.
And if I could just jump in there, that is why bipartisan policy is so important, right? The risk of policy reversal is huge. And it makes policy fragile, and it doesn't encourage the investment you want for the long-term growth of your technology or change in practice. That is why we do what we do, because if we have buy-in from both sides of the aisle, there's much lower risk of policy reversal. That was great. That was perfect. Yeah, that was great.
And I think that actually has to close our panel because we're at time. But thank you so much, everybody on the panel.